Hello, my name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Delighted to have you with us today. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to one of my favorite people. Chief Cadmus Delorme is the chief of the Cowessess First Nation. Emerged in the last couple of years as one of the most innovative and creative Indigenous leaders or political leaders of any description in this country. He's a Cree and Saulteaux person. He is a graduate of the Johnson Soyama Graduate School of Public Policy and a graduate of First Nations University. He's got a remarkable set of accomplishments for somebody of his age. He was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. He's named as one of CBC's Saskatchewan Future 40, celebrating the newest leaders emerging within the province there. He's worked at First Nations University of Canada when he made the rather unusual decision to seek election as the chief of the Cowessess First Nation. He lives with his family on the Cowessess First Nation. He was reelected as chief in April of 2019, and he's joining us today simply to talk about the work that he's doing and the kind of the role that he plays as a chief. So, Chief, welcome, and delighted to have you with us today.
Ken, glad to be a part of this.
Well, you've been impressing me for a long time, but I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about the Cowessess First Nation. I'm interested in the history, culture, location. Speak to as though you're talking to Canadians who have trouble finding Regina on a map.
Thank you. I'm 39 years young. I grew up on Cowessess First Nation, and I came back at the age of 34 to run as chief. The way that our elections work, it's popularity vote today through an election act. So minus the party's style, you run for your position. Other people will run for the chief position, and that's how elections happen. They happen every 4 years based on our election act. Cowessess First Nation, we are east of Regina. We are an hour and 40 minutes east if you drive the speed limit of Regina, 165 kilometers. Ancestors of Cowessess First Nation include Saulteaux, Cree, Nakota, and Métis heritage. We're a diverse First Nation and very proud of it. Our ancestors were very nomadic on this land prior to Treaty of 1874. After 1874, our chief agreed to Treaty 4, which we settled here in around 1880. For 5 generations, we have lived here in our land based. And now today, our citizens total 4,300 citizens. 900 live on Cowessess First Nation. The remaining 3,300 live across Canada. We have 1,400 that live in the city of Regina. Even though we get most of our program services for our 900 citizens, like health, education, areas like that, we still have a strong relationship with all of our citizens across this country. We are working on many areas, but the 3 pillars that we focus on today is political sovereignty. A few months ago, you may have seen Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Moe came to Cowessess. We signed a child welfare agreement that gives jurisdiction and sovereignty back to Cowessess First Nation. So political sovereignty is huge in our moving forward. Secondly is economic self-sustainability. We have the mentality that every one of our children should wake up and watch their parents get ready for work during the week. We don't judge. We know we inherited a situation here today of intergenerational trauma stemming from residential school time, from the Indian Act, imprisonment mentality, and so forth. So we want to make sure economic self-sustainability is a part of our future. We are in the agriculture industry, the renewable energy industry. We have a lot of land from urban development and so forth. Our third pillar is cultural rejuvenation. We want to make sure that anybody that's from Cowessess, doesn't matter where you put your head on your pillow, that you know who you are, where you come from, and where we're going as a First Nation.
That's an impressive list. And thank you very much for that introduction. And so we're going to come back to sort of talk about certain parts of this. Can I ask you a sort of a fairly blunt question, if you don't mind? You graduated with a master's degree in public administration. You were working at First Nations University of Canada. And I'll editorialize here a bit by simply saying that the job of a First Nations chief is probably the most difficult political job in all of Canada. What convinced you to run?
I love being First Nation. I grew up on Cowasses. I helped leadership before being a chief. I was one of those ones that would volunteer, show up to community events, and my drive is to get stronger for the First Nation. I got interested in being a chief when I started to learn about the true history. Just because I'm First Nation doesn't necessarily mean that I know my history through and through. I learned majority of what happened to my people, my parents from First Nations University of Canada. And a warrior spirit awoken in me when I was there. And that warrior spirit is to bring peace. How do we bring peace between Indigenous people and Canada so our children and children yet unborn can have a prosperous future as we share this land? I felt the tone starts at the top. I'm also Institute of Corporate Directors designation, Ken, and one of the things that we learned there is tone starts at the top. And so I wanted to be the chief because I really feel the tone starts at the top. And you're right, being a chief is not a prime minister, it's not a premier, it's not a mayor, it's not a reeve. You're a chief. In my day, I'm dealing with injustice in hospitals. This morning, I dealt with a citizen who she felt she was treated unjustly, racism, as she said. So I had to work with the regional health authority. At lunchtime, I'm helping another family plan for a funeral coming up. We then had to have a COVID-19 task force team meeting. I had an economic development meeting. I'm talking to you now. And right after this, we're doing another COVID task force thing. And then this evening, we're doing a sports event. So, ultimately, as a chief, I'm not a decision maker. I'm the spokesperson, and I am asked to be present in a lot of different scenarios. And that's something I take very seriously.
It's a great description, and I love your enthusiasm and your commitment to your community and to the First Nation itself, and indirectly, Chief, to the country. I mean, you've got an interesting perspective here because you're not opposed to Canada, you're not opposed to the federal system or the provincial system. You really seem to be willing to work within the structures as they are, but simply to demand far more for your community. Is that a fair statement?
It is, Ken. We are all here today sharing because of treaty. And unfortunately, our education system missed the opportunity. And I am optimistic and hopeful in this country that my 5-year-old daughter will have it different than how most Indigenous people today have to live in this country. And I will strive one day at a time to help implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice. And also, I'm a Canadian. I love my passport. I go to other countries and they ask me where you're from. I can't say Kawasas in Cuba because they don't know where Kawasas is. But when I say Canada, they're like, oh, Canada. And but I'm what you call a dual citizen. And that's something that's not a bad thing. It's something that we just must understand. As First Nations people, we're rights holders in this country. We're not shareholders, stakeholders. So, my Indigenous ideology, my inherent right, that's a right in this country I have. I'm also a Canadian citizen. So being a dual citizen, there is nothing wrong with us understanding that First Nations do play that role. And I think that's where the opposite of hope comes from, is the fight of the white paper mentality to just be one or the other. And that's not what we want for our children.
I think so few people really remember what the white paper was all about, and yet it's such an important part to First Nations people because in 1969, the government of Canada actually released a white paper that would have talked about the abolition of First Nation status, the abolition of First Nation reserves, the division of the land, and whatever. And I don't think most Canadians understand how aggressive that action was. You know, for the government of Canada thinking we can just obliterate this whole concept of identity and process. So let me ask you the question that I think is most important to me in all of this. You talked about treaty and the fact that you understand this in context of your relationships with Canada and what have you. I had 3 children who went through the school system. 4 children actually went through the school system in the province of Saskatchewan. And they did not get an introduction to the treaty. They did not grow up with a sense of connectedness to your community or to other First Nations or the Métis people. How do we fill that vessel with power? How do we fill the treaty vessel with real power so that non-Indigenous people say with as much pride and commitment as you just did that you are a treaty person?
Thank you, Ken. First off, it has to start with truth. I'm going to just start with truth, and then I'm going to get to the analogy of treaty. In this country, the education system that we inherited failed us in the fact that what is the truth of Indigenous people when it comes to the relationship with Canada. The baby boomer generation, the entire education system come from Hollywood movies. So teepees, feathers, horses, making warrior calls. That was the most education baby boomers got in this country. Generation X, the white paper. That's why the white paper is seen as an option. It is not an option. Generation Y started to get a little better, but residential schools were still here. Treaties were starting to be talked about. The Indian Act was starting to be talked about. The millennial generation and the generation today, they are getting taught the spirit and intent of treaties. So we are going to see a shift. But today, we're not all mandatory to get out Indigenous Studies 100 class in this country. We have to try and come to our understanding of truth. But this is treaty to the ones that are looking to better understand. The signatory chief of Cowessess First Nation, his name was Chief Cowessess. If you want to use the language, it was Kwiwizants. So Chief Cowessess, the 2 days before we agreed to Treaty 4, my signatory chief in 1874, he seen this lawyer sitting there, and he didn't understand what a lawyer was, but he knew that he went to school this lawyer to be a lawyer because everybody was going to the lawyer. And so my chief said, if we agree to treaty, can my children be like him while still being me? And they said, absolutely, he can. Your kids can do that. That's what treaty is about. So that's what my chief agreed to. And think of it as 2 canoes going down a river. I'm not talking wampum treaty. I'm just giving you an analogy of 2 canoes going down the river. One canoe is Cowessess. The other canoe is the Crown, Canada, Saskatchewan, where I am right now. We agreed to flow down this river as long as the sun shines, grass grows, river flows. Every generation, we were to exchange a child in the other canoe to raise them, to know the ideology, and then come back. That way, we would always prosper together. That didn't happen. 2 years after Treaty 4, the Indian Act was thrown in our canoe without our consent, had one purpose: to imprison the minds of Cowessess people, that we don't know our governance, that women play a less role, so forth. 22 years later, the residential school was thrown in our canoe. It had one purpose: to brainwash Indigenous people, to not know our language, to not know the spiritual connection of men with braids and so forth. So today, the Cowessess canoe fell behind. We're not asking Canada to slow down. We're asking Canada invest in our canoe so we could catch up to what a true treaty relationship should be in this country. If anybody thinks that we should abandon our canoe, you're thinking white paper. That'll never happen. Delete that and let's just focus on a true nation-to-nation relationship. That's what I mean. I love being Canada because that's our treaty, but I love being Cowessess, and that's something we shouldn't be shy of.
No, I agree. Not shy, proud. We should be very proud of this, Chief, and you give us very many reasons to be proud. Speak to us really quickly about, if you don't mind, about this agreement you signed with the government of Canada and the province of Saskatchewan. It's a child welfare agreement. It actually gives you the resources. It's not just about sovereignty, because sovereignty carries with responsibilities. So the question is, how do you exercise those? So you're actually going to see a fairly substantial growth in the size of your government, with these responsibilities to deal with child welfare across the country. And clearly nothing is more important to your community than the children. So speak to us a little bit about how important that agreement is to you.
We have jurisdiction since April 1st, so we are in month 7 right now. We had 3 children in care on Cowessess April 1st. As of August, we have no children in care. We already repatriated our children back to their families. That is why it is so important. So what we did is, and this, we asked a question to Canada. When did we give you jurisdiction to look after our children in care? When did we say, Canada, Saskatchewan, here's our children, look after them? We never did that. 1876, the Indian Act came. Canada never come and consulted with Cowasses. It was just assimilation. 1951, the province of Saskatchewan said, we're taking Section 88 of the Indian Act and we're going to assert jurisdiction over Cowasses children in care. Nobody ever come and asked us. In 2021, Cowasses looked at Canada and Saskatchewan and said, we are asserting our jurisdiction over our children in care. So from the Canada canoe, it's Bill C-92, are now today an act representing First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children and family services. To Cowasses, it's our constitution and our law called the Mio-Pima-Tisawin Act, which is our child welfare. We gave it to Canada after we ratified it and said, insert this into your Section 35 of your constitution, invest in our canoe, and Awas and Cree get out of our canoe and let us do our thing. And so that is a prime example, Ken, of how Cowessess' canoe is better aligning. We're in month 7, Ken, and we are just so much ahead already in only month 7, and repatriating families, growing culture plans, kinship plans, making our youth and children more proud to know where they come from and where we're going as a First Nation.
Well, someday I will tell you how incredibly proud I am of what your community has achieved, what you have achieved in this process. I think when you describe this, you know very well the difference between what was like 5 and 10 and 15 years ago and 30 years ago, when dozens of your children were actually lifted out of your communities and raised outside of the Cowessess First Nation with no contact. You know, you're changing lives and changing the whole culture in a very dramatic sort of way. Chief Delorme, it has been a real privilege to watch your evolution and development. You're doing some of the most creative things we've seen in the country. We just applaud you for the work that you're doing and support you in all that you have underway. And I think your description of the canoes and the speeding up of one canoe so it catches up with the other is a wonderful way of telling us about the future. Because what you've painted is a community that's in control of its destiny, absolutely sure of where it's wanting to go, and led by one of the most phenomenal young leaders this country has in its leadership core. So thank you very much for being with us today. This has been a brilliant description of the future of your community and the plans and vision that you have for it. Thank you for being with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Chief Cadmus Delorme.
Thank you, Ken.